We're back to John Howard for the second part of our conversation about his work on the West Bank.
I mean, you can't live in the Holy Land without it affecting the way you read the Bible. Every time you read the Bible, you're reading of people traveling from A to B. I know where A and B are. I've been there. That affects just the stories. It brings them alive in ways that they never were for me before I went and lived, stayed in the country and lived in the country.
You have spent a lot of time observing and reporting back to the World Council of Churches, and you've taken pains to get your reporting to a high standard of integrity and impartiality. What then happens to those reports? Are they just read with benign interest and filed in the usual place, or is any action taken on them?
On one occasion, I visited the US Embassy. When we were almost finished, they said, would you mind if our area coordinator had a conversation with you? And a lady came through who was the area coordinator for the whole of USAID across the West Bank. She wanted to meet with us because she found the EAPPI reports the most useful reports available to her. And she wanted to thank us for the work we did. Quite often, though, you have to say that you do what you can and then hope that what you do will actually make a difference. The danger is that if this situation is not dealt with in a just and peaceful way, it will become even more violent than it is today.
Which brings me to the next question I was going to ask you, because 2013 seems a world away now because so much has changed. And with the new American administration, we've had the moving of the embassy and the green light to Netanyahu to basically say, carry on occupying, carry on developing, no one's going to stop you. That really must make you feel that there is no hope for the two-state solution. There is going eventually to be one Israel, which is what the American right wants. Can you see any chance of that not happening?
It is very difficult for Palestinians and for people who have seen the situation there to maintain any hope of a just resolution. But one of the things that keeps you going is meeting some of the inspirational people, Israeli and Palestinian, who are working for a just peace. Now, I have come to the conclusion myself that the two-state solution will not happen. It is going to be so difficult now to resolve the problems of the settlements. I cannot see how a two-state solution is viable anymore. Mm-hmm. But having said that, my understanding from people I've spoken to at great length on this subject is that the majority of Palestinians didn't want a two-state solution. What most Palestinians will say is that they want a one-state solution in which everybody has equal human rights. And that doesn't seem to me to be unreasonable, and it doesn't seem to me to be something that isn't attainable. Most Palestinians are quite willing to live alongside Israelis. And they will say to you, look, Israelis have been living here now 70 years, some of them. Some of them have seen 3 generations living in the land. They're not going anywhere, and they shouldn't be expected to go anywhere. And these will be Palestinians who are saying it is perfectly possible for Israelis and Palestinians to live alongside each other, but they have to have equal human rights.
Is that not actually in the Israeli constitution that there should be equal rights?
Not in the Israeli constitution. It's in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. But the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that the Israeli Declaration of Independence is not a legal framework. And the nation-state bill that was passed by the Israeli Knesset in 2018 quite specifically made a distinction between Jewish nationals of the State of Israel and non-Jewish nationals of the State of Israel. Now, now I'm talking about Israel itself, not occupied West Bank.
Yeah, yeah. So your hope would be to move gradually towards a unified state with everyone's rights being accepted. And have you got any leverage to work with? Is anyone that you are able to contact responsive to that?
I think that increasing numbers of people, as they see that the two-state solution is no longer viable, are moving towards the thought that the only way out of this now is a one-state solution with equal rights for everybody. That includes a minority, but a significant minority of people within the State of Israel. But it's certainly the case that the majority of people in Israel do not see it that way. And I would have thought that as the years go by, the world community is going to be less and less willing to accept a situation in which, under the state law, Palestinians have less rights than Jewish Israelis. That's going to be an increasing pressure upon the Israeli government. It's also a concern of a lot of the other Arab states. Israel is a very powerful country. Its influence within the Middle East is huge. Countries such as Jordan and Egypt, both of whom have got peace agreements with Israel, are trying to develop both a constructive policy for Palestinians within the context of a peaceful relationship with the State of Israel. I think somewhat mistakenly, I would say, they have therefore seen the need to tone down their criticism of the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli state. And I think you don't actually create justice by turning a blind eye. And you will hear a different type of language from Syria and from Lebanon, both of whom...
in each of those states, I mean, never mind the recent disaster in Lebanon, with each of those states, there are all sorts of internal conflicts, both between the religious communities and within each religious community. So it's difficult to get a sense of the nation thinks this or the nation thinks that.
Yes, that's true. And it's also true that there has been considerable violence. Certainly Lebanon, the most recent Lebanese war, but also the violence that's taken place in Syria, but the civil war taking place there at present, and also, of course, the Golan Heights, which Israel has unilaterally annexed, is actually, under international law, still a part of Syria.
And one senses in all these conflicts that the regional powers, America, Russia particularly, are wanting a piece of the action and are interfering and leaning on different countries, not in a particularly constructive way, because they are trying to maintain their little bit of influence in that part of the world, and that's not helping the smaller countries.
I mean, that's been true, of course, of Britain right from the very beginning. I mean, when you look at the history of the Balfour Declaration, it wasn't out of any great concern for Jewish people. It was out of concern for British interests in the Middle East. And it's been true of America. It remains true too often of Britain again today. British interests in the Middle East often dictate our policies there. And that's often quite short-term interests. Now, of course, what's happened in recent years has been the huge increase in Russian influence in the area, particularly through Syria, and the creation of a major Russian base on the Mediterranean in Syria. The danger is that the Middle East becomes the proxy ground for a new form of Cold War between the United States and Russia.
But sure, that's already happening in Syria, hasn't it?
The Syrian conflict is seen differently from those who have remained in Syria. Many within Syria see Putin as the saviour of the Syrian state. And that in itself is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, terrible things have been done by both sides to each other. Some of the suicide bombings back in the Second Intifada, some of the violence that's been inflicted by Palestinians has been terrible. In recent years, it's been almost 10 times the casualties on the Palestinian side as to the Israeli side. The reason for that is because the power is now entirely with Israel. And that's what's often forgotten. Ordinary Palestinians, and indeed the Palestinian administration, really have no power to change the situation. And that's why it is so difficult for Palestinians to be able to make any progress, either within the administration that they have or in the wider relationship they have with Israel. I mean, people say there's two sides to this conflict, and of course it's true. But it's a bit like saying it's two sides in a football match, where one side has 11 players and the other side has one player.
Yeah, and where international law doesn't seem to count for anything in resolving the conflict anyway, because as we know, Israel's been in breach of international law since 1967, and that's not really made any difference.
Absolutely, yes. And one of the sadnesses is that international law formed after the Second World War is one of the most hopeful indicators that we might have a more peaceful future. To undermine international law in the way that the United States has done and Israel, and more recently Russia has done, is a tragedy, because what it means is that international law as a whole is weakened.
And that's a wrap for this week. Plenty to chew on, I'm sure you'll agree. I'll play you out with a lovely hymn that somehow manages to be affirming and questioning at the same time. Should be much better known. My name's Richard Bradshaw, but yours isn't. So goodbye, and God bless.